Greetings, everyone. Baggy Bag here with another analysis on Resident Evil Requiem. This time, we'll be diving deep into another newly debuting character, Victor Gideon. In just a moment, we'll be continuing with full spoilers ahead, so if you'd like to avoid them, consider this your final warning. With that being said, let's get started. So, Victor Gideon, ultimately the quintessential antagonist featured in the marketing cycle of Requiem through multiple trailers, though the precise label of antagonist becomes a bit more ambiguous once you discover who he really is and what he's after. Requiem is interesting because, for better or worse, your entire understanding of the story is so massively altered by knowing all the details and playing a second or third time. Specifically in Victor's case, his early actions can only be fully explained by knowledge of two critical pieces of information. One, he was a former Umbrella employee and T-virus researcher. And two, Victor is actually a nemesis, of a new type known as Nemesis Gamma, which also uses the NE-alpha parasite as a base. His use of rocket launchers and familiar tentacle-based mutations are very characteristic of a nemesis. This time, though, one ostensibly coded with the instructions to uncover and enact Spencer's ultimate vision, which in this game involves Elpis. Given his complex motivations and exceptional intelligence, he is perhaps the most sophisticated and dangerous nemesis we've seen yet, at least in theory. Now, with these 2 points laid out, it's crucial to understand the brief period that must have taken place between these two eras of his life, one as a T-virus researcher, and the next as an unwavering loyalist to Spencer's aims, possibly by design, as a nemesis. We know that Victor was unable to be located and summoned in court during the Umbrella trials, and this tells us a huge part of the story all on its own. Why? Well, some important context from Grace's report. All throughout the 70s, Spencer's Umbrella would enter a period of ever-rising contentions with the Connections, born of the quote-unquote sharp ideological divide between Marcus and Spencer. This strife would continue through the 80s, with Spencer demoting Marcus through internal politicking and usurping command of Marcus's T-virus research, paving the road for Spencer's long-term strategic plan to be carried out in the clandestine ARC facility. One of these major goals would be developing Elpis, which would then presumably be discovered and unleashed by Victor, post Spencer's death. But before we get deeper into that, a little more context to really convey the full scope of Victor's obligation to Spencer. Obviously, Marcus would not sit well being stripped of his research and significant power. Evidence showed that millions upon millions of dollars flowed from the Connections, a notorious crime syndicate, to Marcus, suggesting that he and his pupil Brandon were intent on regaining the research they had lost and more, seeking perhaps to usurp Spencer in his control over Umbrella. The feud between Umbrella and the Connections would persist all through the late 80s and well into the 90s, with Spencer purging members of Umbrella to minimize the risk of moles being bought out and leaking critical information. Despite this, infiltration continued within Umbrella, reaching new lows in the 90s with Tricell, HCF, and the family all lurking like vultures, just waiting to scoop up leaked Umbrella bioagents and research from the black market. Seething with anger and indignation, Spencer shifted his focus to guarding one specific thing: his research on Elpis, claiming that Elpis would put an end to all rival organizations, and even to Umbrella itself, which implies that Spencer's wish to nullify all viral-based weapons, even those of Umbrella, was conceived all the way back in the 90s. Elpis was then completed sometime before the missile strike in '98, launched to conceal it from Spencer's rivals. This also means that the later attempts to rederive Elpis through blood experimentation post-2000 were actually carried out about a decade later via the Connections, all because they couldn't get the password to unleash what Spencer had already created. Anyway, it's also worth noting that the misconception of Elpis being a mind-control virus likely came from the rival organization's collective understanding of Spencer's later goals, given their focus on controlling human memories and will through viral means. However, looking at Spencer's 4 major goals, it's pretty clear that exploring memory and blood transfer as a way to circumvent death was a separate initiative from Elpis. This means that Spencer's reduction in visits to the orphanage upon Elpis's completion wasn't a result of finalizing Elpis through blood transfer experiments on the young girls in the 80s and 90s, but instead a result of giving up on those experiments, having finalized Elpis separately, and seeing the value and hope of preserving human existence only in the way we already do, through children, a theme woven into Grace's journey of uncovering her desire for motherhood. This key misconception, though, this conflation of Elpis with blood transfer experiments on children, is something Victor would discover long before the quintessential figurehead of the connections in the modern day. Zeno, the man who would pursue blood and memory transfer post-2000 because he thought these efforts were related to producing Elpis, hence the conflation of an antiviral cure with a mind-controlling virus. This would be very important for Victor to not only uncover, but to use in manipulating his unknowing rival. Here's how those events must have transpired. Considering the timeline, it's likely that Spencer must have taken quick action in his later years to create a Nemesis Gamma out of the T researcher that was Victor Gideon, probably in secret during Victor's time as director of the Chronic Care Center. This only begs the question. While the Victor we see in the modern day seems unflinching in his devotion to Spencer's goals, it's unclear whether he was always in Spencer's corner and perhaps volunteered to obey Spencer's instructions as a nemesis, or if Victor was coerced to take on this duty by Spencer and implanted within any alpha parasite beyond his will. Either way, Victor would then prove his worth to the connections and work with them undercover. In late 2004, shortly after Umbrella was put on trial and out of commission, Victor wrote, "My master's research has come to fruition, and that child, she must be the final piece of the puzzle. I need to get my hands on the child's data. I'm sure this will bring me closer to his vision." Note that Victor is still open to just now uncovering the precise vision of Spencer. Interesting, because again, either he is pursuing this as a die-hard servant to Spencer, or he'd been forcibly programmed as a Nemesis Gamma to drop everything he was doing in his life previously to pursue this instead. Victor then writes, "The organization was able to get me the child's medical records." By the organization, he's referring to the connections. Now, considering the court's inability to locate and summon Victor during Umbrella's trials, this was probably thanks to the connections covering his precise whereabouts, all before he continued his research at the Chronic Care Center, maintaining a very clean record from then on. Note that Victor was intent on confirming Grace's identity as far back as 2004, whereas this next file suggests that the connections found a detective to feed them info on Grace in 2026. The gap between these dates suggests two things. First, the connections weren't interested in the girl they thought to be the original, per se, until 2026, and that they'd instead try to duplicate her through blood transfer experiments for years, using her medical records. And second, that Victor knew to find out more about a certain subject as early as 2004, and this might have been through his programming as a nemesis. Being a loyalist to Spencer's vision, yet masquerading as one of the connection's trusted figures, Victor would now be in a prime position to seek out the truth about his master's true intentions with Elpis. While it might seem strange that Victor would wait 20 years to go after her when he already had her medical records, this seems to have been a case of Spencer deliberately concealing her precise identity from Victor and everyone else, but cluing him in on her genetic info. This is more or less confirmed once you reach the blood facility behind the Chronic Care Center and read Grace Ashcroft blood analysis report. By this point in the story, Victor had abducted Grace from the streets to perform a blood extraction in the Chronic Care Center, taken the extracted blood to the facility in the courtyard, and matched up Grace's blood with that of the medical records he had accessed in 2004. This also makes the connection's efforts to recreate her make much more sense, since if they didn't even know who Grace was, how would they go about trying to clone her? Because they had her genetic info, but not her identity. When Victor shouts, "I've done it," and then laughs maniacally, he's talking about matching up Grace's genetic info with this older file, finally confirming who Spencer's golden child really was, even still not knowing how exactly. He plants the seeds for Zeno to continue to believe that Grace is special, though Victor likely knows from this point forth that something else entirely is at play in terms of Spencer's vision. His fanatical excitement illustrates his passion for locking in this crucial piece to the puzzle and expressing veneration for his master beyond the grave.
I've done it.
That abrupt transition between his hysterical laughter and robotic march away is perhaps an early suggestion of his programmed nature as a nemesis. Moving on, what's also interesting is this line.
Because my master made you who you are.
While the obvious interpretation is that Spencer had Grace raised as an ordinary child without any biological tampering, Victor didn't know that at this point in history, but knew that Grace was special in some way. Now, because Grace gets bitten by a mutated T-virus zombie right before Victor captures her, it almost makes me wonder if Victor also found evidence of Elpis in Grace's blood and hid this from Zeno. That would explain Grace's immunity to being infected from the bite in the Wrenwood Hotel, if an Elpis injection also functioned as a vaccine of sorts. Sure, Grace wasn't the key to synthesizing Elpis and isn't genetically special, but what if she was given an injection of Elpis by Spencer or maybe Alyssa before it was sealed away beneath Raccoon City? Something to think about, because otherwise, this bite is just misleading beyond belief, shown in a cutscene within a game that emphasizes the danger of the mutated T-virus infection. Not being infected in that case is outright distracting. Getting back to Victor, the rest of his story pretty much tells itself. Zeno horribly misinterpreted Spencer's true goals with Elpis, specifically in the precise way that it would upset the power balance of the world. Victor, on the other hand, was able to make the distinction between the blood transfer experiments conducted by the Connections, specifically on Emily, and the lack of any association with Grace's blood. This would reveal his master's true intentions for what they actually were, as understood by Spencer's loyal servant. Right? I suppose this last bit is still a tad open, and I alluded to this a little bit at the end of my Zeno character analysis. Victor's interpretation of Spencer's vision is this. Elpis, being the ultimate cure for viral bioagents, would eliminate any power disparities between nations by means of nullifying all viruses, upsetting the military balance of the world. The prospect of introducing anarchy in this way really excites Victor, as if he's finally landed on the horizon of his master's true goal. However, there's two aspects of this story that don't really seem to add up here. First of all, if Spencer's primary motivation to release Elpis was to atone on a personal level, despite all the lives he destroyed through his various experiments, it doesn't seem like giving rise to chaos across the globe is something he's really looking to do. It's as if Victor misinterpreted Spencer's vision, or Spencer didn't really know what he was going for himself, creating an all-curing antiviral while simultaneously bringing in a new kind of anarchy to various countries. Grace's report does suggest a duality in using Elpis to nullify viral weapons, versus using it as a curve for the infected. However, the second thing I was going to mention is where this line gets even more blurred. Leon. If organizations like the DSO and the BSAA have themselves been trying to eliminate power disparities between different countries, what is exactly the issue with what Victor is suggesting? Yes, maybe dictating the precise usage of Elpis is important to Leon, but he, Victor, and Chris ultimately seem to have roughly the same goal, even using similar language as Chris's narration in RE5.
It didn't take long after the fall of the Umbrella Corporation for their bioweapons to end up in the hands of terrorists. A new era of bioterrorism descended upon vulnerable countries, shifting the balance of power throughout the region.
I agree that there's some nuance to it, and I appreciate that. But generally, a final confrontation is between two figures with fundamentally antithetical goals, and this really isn't that. Aside from this, I can't express how happy I am at Victor's inclusion in this game. He does fit the mold of an Ouroboros type of villain very well, like Wesker from RE5, Nicholas Griffith from the Caliban Cove novel, Dylan Blake from RE Death Island, and many more. The type of RE villain that strives to be the pre-existent entity before the creation of their new world, cleansing the slate of humanity in the precise way they envision, or in this case, that his master may have envisioned. The myth archetype known as Ouroboros is described as this pre-existent entity, pun not intended with Wesker's Ouroboros in RE5. It represents giving birth to a new age and ruling over it as a god, or at least a demiurge who thinks so. Considering this, Victor's snake motif is right on the money. He seeks to shed away the skin of a world deadlocked by power, specifically, power imposed by the possession of viral weapons. What do you think of this character? Do his decisions actually add up in a way that I'm not seeing? Leave all your thoughts in the comments. My goal, as always, is to get you thinking and to hopefully gain a greater appreciation for these characters and stories. We'll catch you next time on The Residents of Evil. Until then, just remember that you are nothing but an imitation.